Hey folks, in this video we're going to look at the subject of climate change and global warming. What's the evidence that this is happening? So we'll start with just a basic discussion of what we mean by global warming and the greenhouse effect. Exactly what is that? What's going on? And then we'll look at the evidence for this global warming that's going on. So first of all, let's understand that we've got this energy balance that's important actually for life on this planet. So we get energy coming in from sunlight through the atmosphere. Some of that light gets scattered away and reflected back out, but quite a bit of it, 46% of it, reaches the Earth's surface. Then what happens? Well, of course, it warms the Earth's surface. It's absorbed by the Earth's surface. But then the Earth re-emits some of that light back into the atmosphere. 37% of that is emitted. Now, the light's coming in from the sun is largely visible light and ultraviolet light. The high-energy ultraviolet light, of course, gets absorbed by the ozone layer, but the longer wavelength ultraviolet light does get through the atmosphere. So we've got ultraviolet visible, a little bit of infrared, but that is the light that's coming in. What gets re-emitted from the Earth's surface is largely infrared radiation that gets back out into the atmosphere. Now, that's 37%, as I mentioned, gets into re-emitted as IR, and then molecules within the atmosphere will absorb some of that infrared radiation, not all of it, but will absorb some of that infrared radiation and trap it as heat, all right, that helps to warm it. Now, under normal circumstances, that's actually really important. We have to have some greenhouse effect due to atmospheric gases absorbing that some of that infrared radiation and trapping the heat to keep the Earth at a temperature that allows for life. The average temperature is roughly 15 degrees Celsius here on the Earth, without any greenhouse effect whatsoever. If there weren't molecules in the atmosphere absorbing that infrared radiation, then the temperature would actually be negative 18 degrees Celsius, which would be inhospitable for life. Of course, water would be ice at that temperature. So we have to have some greenhouse effect in order for life to exist. The molecules in the atmosphere have to absorb and trap some of that radiation so that the Earth remains at a warm, hospitable temperature. All right, so what's going on now that leads us to believe that we've got some issues? This particular graph here shows the average global surface temperature from 1880 to 2020, and the source for this is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration here, gathering these temperatures. And you can definitely see that from the 1880s on, we've had this warming trend, and actually that warming trend has accelerated over the past 40 or 50 years. So that we see we've got quite a bit of warming going on. And if we look at then heat waves, and that when we talk about heat waves, we're talking about situations where the daily highs as a percentage of the land area. So on this graph here, we've got percent of land area that experiences daily highs beyond what would have been the case in the past. So we're definitely seeing this trend here of an increase of the percentage of land areas that's getting really, really hot daily highs, hotter than have been the case in the past. So that's important because there's a larger percentage of land within the continental U.S., all right, that's getting these heat waves with these high daily highs. And actually, as I'm recording this, in June of 2021, we're actually seeing a pretty significant heat wave out west due to this. So the daily highs are higher as a result of what's going on in the past few decades, and actually the percentage of the continental U.S. that's experiencing these daily highs these heat waves is increased over that time. And again, the source for this is a Union of Concerned Scientists, but actually it comes from a report from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, so what do we know about all this stuff? So what's the cause of it? How do we know these trends? How do we know the temperature changes that are going on? How do we know what's in the atmosphere and the changes within the atmosphere? Well, certainly in recent decades, we can make actual measurements of the atmospheric content and the atmosphere and the temperature of the Earth's surface. But if we want to go really far back in the past, what scientists are going to be using are ice core samples, where they might, for example, to determine the composition of the atmosphere, they can go to Antarctica and they can extract these ice cores, and they can look at the composition of the gases in the bubbles that are trapped within the ice cores, and that composition of gases within the bubbles tells us something about the atmospheric composition at that time. So the ice core samples do that. They also allow us not only to determine the composition of the samples, but we can also, based on isotopic measurements of the relative amounts of the isotopes present in the ice, we can determine the temperature, because there is a direct correlation between the isotopic composition and the temperature. And in this case, we can look at, for example, and it's not just hydrogen isotopes, we can also look at oxygen isotopes. So with these isotopic measurements, what we can do is figure out the temperature. So we've got deuterium, which is H2 here, all right, and H2 means that it's got, if you recall, one neutron and one proton. The mass number is 2. That's what's in the nucleus, all right, and that's the isotope. Of course, that's not the dominant isotope that appears in nature. That's hydrogen 1, which just has one proton. That's normal hydrogen that exists as a primary form of hydrogen that exists within nature. But there is deuterium in nature, and measuring the isotopic ratios of the hydrogen 1 to hydrogen 2 allows for a calculation of the temperature, because as the temperatures are higher, as you see right here, we get a higher ratio of the heavier to the lighter isotopes. In other words, and the heavier isotope, of course, would be deuterium. So there is a way to calculate the temperature based on that. We, of course, won't go into the details. It's actually very complex. But by measuring those isotopic ratios, we can calculate the temperatures, and we can go quite far back with these ice core samples to determine that. And this shows, in this particular diagram, we see an ice core, all right, with these striations here that represent the different years. I mean, there's a way to determine the years based on the layers and the striations that appear within that sample. All right, so here is a more recent determination of carbon dioxide. For example, we know that carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, is one of the atmospheric gases that we can measure. And so we see that carbon dioxide over the past 60 years has shown a steady but rapid increase over that time from 1960 to 2020, as we see here in this particular diagram. Again, the sources here, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, doing these calculations. Within a given year, we also see these oscillations, and we won't go into the details here. The seasonal changes are actually to be expected, and that's accounts for these little oscillations along this graph. But the general trend is one that's increasing rapidly as we go through it, and of course that's due to the burning of fossil fuels, which generates carbon dioxide. So we're seeing this increase in carbon dioxide concentration due to that. All right, and this goes back, we can see here, 800,000 years. If you take a look at this, we're talking about going back 800,000 years, and again, using ice core samples to determine the carbon dioxide concentrations going back during that time. And you can see that the concentrations and the units here are parts per million, okay, in the atmosphere. So that's up and down, it oscillates, of course, but the average is right along here, somewhere below 250 parts per million. But then we see, recently, this incredibly large increase in the carbon dioxide concentration. It's above 400 parts per million. All right. And so that, of course, is an anomaly compared to the last 800,000 years, what's going on here. So we're certainly seeing a lot of evidence for an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So you may say, so what? Well, there's definitely a correlation between that and temperature. All right, as you can see from this graph here, going back, say, 400,000 years or so, the red here indicates the temperature, okay, and the blue here represents the carbon dioxide concentration. And I think you can see that there is, well, there's noise as it goes up and down. There is certainly a relationship. When the carbon dioxide concentration goes up, the temperature goes up. So that's an important issue to note. There is a relationship between the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and the temperature. Why is that? Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It absorbs infrared radiation. The mechanism for that we'll talk about in a subsequent video. We'll go into that in more detail in a subsequent video, but we definitely see this relationship between carbon dioxide concentration and temperature. All right, and we can actually then ask, well, are we sure that this is something that's caused by humans? The International Panel for Climate Change has, with a high degree of certainty, declared that anthropogenic, which is human causes, have been a primary cause for this global warming that we're seeing and the resulting climate change that we're already seeing is occurring. And then we have these computer models that kind of bear this out. So in these models, okay, the black line represents the actual observation here of temperature, including both land and ocean. The purple here represents models that are just looking at possible changes due to natural causes, whatever they might be. And the kind of salmon, maybe a little pinkish color here, corresponds to a model which includes anthropogenic cause. In other words, for example, the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. There are other greenhouse gases that also are coming from a variety of sources. Factory farming produces a lot of methane, for example, greenhouse gases as well. So the anthropogenic causes, the computer models that model the temperature, including anthropogenic cause, actually track very well the actual temperature changes that we're seeing. So the evidence seems clear, first of all, that warming is occurring. Then secondly, that the primary cause is anthropogenic. Now, again, the mechanisms for this and why these greenhouse gases absorb infrared radiation, what's going on with that, we're going to talk about in a subsequent video. So stay tuned for that. And as always, ask questions. See you later.